Before we move on to our next state exercise, I wanted to quickly recap state versus props and also introduce an idea called state as props. So let's recap first. These two concepts, state and props, are the two most important things in React after, knowing what the basics of a component, what a component actually is and how to define one. We use state and props all of the time. So here's a little table that compares them. Both state and props are plain old JavaScript objects, little curly brace objects, key value pairs. But there's a couple of significant differences. One is that state is mutable. You can change it. Props are immutable. We saw earlier in the course, if you try and change one, it's not going to let you. In addition, state, the whole point of it is to store changing data that relates to that component. It's a data store that keeps track of information that could dictate how things are displayed on the page, for example, and it can change. Props, on the other hand, are also an object, but they are immutable, and they store component configuration information, so they don't change. This brings me to my next point, state as props. So this is something that will come up a lot in the course. It's basically a pattern for creating and defining your application structure. So what we'll have is a stateful parent component, a smart component, that passes its state values down as props to the dumber stateless components, so children components. So it might look something like this. We have a parent component. Don't worry about what these components do, but we have a parent which has some sort of state. It's a stateful component. Let's say count is set to 5. But what it actually renders is another component where we pass in the current state, this.state.count, as a prop. So the counter child component actually is not stateful. It would just use props. And we don't have proof of that because we don't actually see the component definition. But I'm telling you, in this pattern, we have a parent component that is managing state, and it passes its state down, or at least part of the state down, to a child component as props. So in this child component, we're accessing this.props.count to access this information. So I don't expect you to absorb this whole idea right now, but I wanted to introduce it. It will come up a lot, especially in the next section after our exercise. We're going to talk about state patterns. But this idea is really important. We have a stateful parent component, keeps track of some information that changes, and it renders dumber stateless components, and it passes information down as props. So when the state changes here, this counter child will be re-rendered. And in general, we call this the downward data flow. So components will get simpler as you go down the hierarchy. So parents often are more stateful than their children. Okay, that's all I want to say for now. Next, we're going to move on to another exercise using state.